Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of content, slow, immersive stories that help you fall asleep, take a moment now to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and if you find it's not for you, you can always unsubscribe later. No pressure at all. Now, let's leave the day behind. Take a deep breath, let the noise of the world fall away like dust from an old velvet curtain. You're here now with the past. If you're listening in the dark, even better. Let the low hum of your fan become the wind off ancient rooftops. Let the warmth of your blanket become the fire of a candlelit chamber. Tonight, we're not reading history. We're stepping into it, quietly, carefully. You're not just hearing a story, you're inside it. So before we begin, take a moment to let your body go heavy. Feel the bed beneath you. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. Let your fingers curl loosely. Let your feet fall outward. There's nowhere to be but here. No one to impress. Nothing to do. Just this moment, this breath, this story. Close your eyes if they're not closed already. It's not 20 or 25 anymore. Not here. Let's begin. They say Rome was not built in a day, but if you asked him, he would have told you it was built just for him. And today, like every day, it would rise for his pleasure. The sun had barely peeled over the red-tiled roofs of the Palatine Hill when he awoke, not to the sound of roosters or market carts, but to the soft rustle of silk being drawn back. A servant, one of 7 assigned only to his sleeping chamber, whispered that it was morning. Another knelt at the edge of the bed with his slippers. A third stood ready with his morning wine, warmed slightly with honey and a sprig of mint, just how he liked it. He did not rise right away. He liked to begin slowly, letting the weight of his own importance settle over the city like a fog. One cannot rush magnificence. So he sat upright, allowed 2 slaves to fan the last of the night's heat from his shoulders, and drank deeply. It was not water. Water was for labourers. He stretched. Not the kind of stretch a soldier gives before marching, but the kind that says, "Let the world wait." And it would. For him, it always did. He had a bath scheduled, not a simple wash, but a full procession. Steam, oils, exfoliation with crushed apricot stone, and a servant who whispered poetry while drying his hair with linen. But first, his appearance. A man like him could not simply emerge. He had to be unveiled. From a cabinet carved with scenes of Bacchus came his morning robe. Gold-threaded, soft, and utterly impractical. He wore it only in the mornings, and only on days that ended in Dash Day. His sandals were presented like prizes. 1 pair from Greece, 1 from Gaul, 1 with little lion heads, on the buckles that he liked to wear when feeling dangerous. He chose none of them. He would go barefoot to remind people that power did not require shoes. Breakfast was a performance. A single fig, halved and dusted with cinnamon, was placed on a marble plate. It was the same fig every morning. He never ate it. The fig was symbolic. Of what no one knew, not even him, but it seemed mysterious and deliberate. That was enough. As he moved through the atrium, house slaves bowed without looking him in the eye. A little girl, the daughter of one of his scribes, presented him with a drawing she had made of his chariot. He took it, kissed her on the forehead, and then gave the drawing to his steward to have it engraved on the bottom of his wine cups. Immortality should start young. He was due at the Forum, but not for politics. No, today was for being seen, not for doing. His steps led him instead toward the bathhouse, not the public ones. Those were for sweaty senators and self-important rhetoricians. He had his own private quarters at the Baths of Caracalla, shielded behind thick drapes and guarded by men with no necks and questionable pasts. But before he arrived, there was the matter of the poet. A wiry man with an olive branch crown and nervous fingers approached him outside the temple steps. "A small verse, sir," the man said, "in praise of your beauty, if I may." He allowed it. The poet began, "O sun among mortals, whose gaze lights the path." He waved him off. "Boring," he said. "Try again, but make me a god, not a torch." The poet nodded, scribbled, tried again. "O wine of Venus, whose lips inspire music!" "Better," he said, and gave him a silver ring he didn't like. At the baths he was received like a consul. Attendants peeled away his robe, not in haste but reverence. Steam coiled in golden light. Oils were chosen, perfumes debated. In the tepidarium he reclined, arms spread, listening to the water's echo and the soft arguments of philosophers who didn't know he was listening. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone bent the temperature of the room. The morning would end with a massage so elaborate it required 3 men, a fig-scented towel, and a harpist, and that was just the morning. By the time his toes touched the marble of the caldarium floor, the city outside was fully awake, but inside, everything remained hushed and orchestrated, like a temple of water built for worshipping only him. He liked his steam thick and his music soft. The harpist played a slow progression, a melody that had no beginning and no end, which he claimed sounded like time itself. He agreed, mostly because he didn't care what it sounded like, only that it made people feel clever for listening to it. He reclined on a chaise of imported cedar, letting the oil soak into his skin. A servant came forward with a platter of small soaps carved into the shapes of gods. He took the one shaped like Mercury, because Mercury was fast, and he liked the idea of washing quickly even if he never did. Outside the baths, 2 senators argued about the price of Egyptian grain. Inside, he asked for a foot massage using goat milk cream and lavender because that's what Cleopatra supposedly used. He had never met her, yet, but he felt they might be on similar frequencies. An hour later, fully perfumed and robed once again, he emerged into the sunlight as though debuting for the 2nd time that day. A group of local boys followed him briefly, pretending to be his retinue. He let them. Why not train the next generation in proper ore? His next stop was not on any calendar. He made it a habit to appear where he was least expected but most admired. Today, that meant the house of the Vestals. Not to intrude, he would never, but to linger nearby, as if casually reminding them that not all men required fire to burn. One of them giggled. He heard it. He filed it away like a feather in his mental headdress. Lunch would begin soon, and lunch was no small matter. But first, a moment by the fountain near the temple of Castor and Pollux. He liked the echo there. If he said something profound, it sounded twice as wise. If he said something foolish, it echoed just enough to sound deliberate. He stood there for a while, arms crossed, staring into the water as though deciding something of state. In truth, he was wondering whether to request peacock again, or try the stuffed dormice everyone had been talking about. A boy approached with a scroll, an invitation to a midday poetry duel. He declined. Competing was beneath him. Spectating, however, was still an option. He made his way slowly through the streets, past the butchers and perfume stalls, his path parting like a tide. People didn't bow exactly, they just made space, the way people do for statues, or street performers, or things they're not entirely sure they're allowed to touch. By the time he reached his villa again, the cooks were already preparing lunch. Not one cook, of course. That would be insulting. He had 5, one for meats, one for fruits, one for sauces, one for novelty, and one who did nothing but plate things dramatically. He settled into his dining couch, arms propped on embroidered cushions. A large feather fan was waved gently above him by a servant who swore he had once fanned a senator into sleep. Good credentials. Lunch began not with food, but with an announcement. The table has been arranged in the shape of a dolphin. Applause followed. From whom, no one was sure. The first course was boiled ostrich egg, followed by sea urchin on honeyed bread, and finally the dormice, each nestled in its own little leaf wrap like a tiny secret. He ate with slow precision, like a man carving his name into time. Then came the entertainment. 2 jugglers, a flautist, and a man who claimed to be able to wrestle shadows. He did not wrestle shadows. Still, it was a good lunch, and the day was just beginning. He liked to begin the afternoon with a sigh, not because he was tired, but because it made others believe he had already lived a full day by lunch. And in a way he had. He had been fanned, fed, flattered, and finally oiled. Most men died wishing for half of that. He lay back on the couch in his reading chamber, though no one had ever seen him read, while two servants debated which curtain colour best suited his post-lunch complexion. One voted for plum, the other for ivory. He chose neither. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Surprise me." Outside his window, the sounds of Rome's afternoon unfolded like a slow opera. The distant clatter of hooves, a fruit vendor shouting about figs, someone being mildly stabbed over a dice. He found it soothing. He did not nap. He reclined dramatically. A nap suggested need. Reclining suggested art. Around the 4th hour, the house steward entered with a dilemma. A senator's wife had arrived. She claimed to be lost. She was not. She had brought with her a bottle of wine older than her marriage and a scroll of poetry she pretended was for her husband. He received her in the triclinium, not the good one, just in case she turned out dull. They spoke of literature and of flowers and of a marble sculpture in the shape of a fish that she found oddly moving. She leaned in. He offered grapes. She declined. He admired her restraint. And then he escorted her out with the grace of a man who wanted her to leave before the wine tasting began. The wine tasting, of course, was not a public event. Nothing he did was public, but everything he did became public later. He'd hand-selected the vintages himself, or rather had told his wine servant, "Bring only the wines that make me feel like I understand Greek philosophy." 6 men arrived, 2 senators, 1 actor, 1 poet, 1 man who claimed to be descended from a god, and 1 who had not been invited but came anyway. They drank slowly at first. They discussed Plato, misquoted Cicero, and invented new insults for Stoics. Someone declared that wine was the only truth. Someone else declared that truth was overrated. Laughter followed. Then silence. Then more wine. At some point a lyre was produced. No one could play it. This did not stop them. He left them gently humming in the courtyard and decided to take a walk. He liked to be seen walking, casually as though he had nowhere important to be, which made people wonder where he might be going. The marketplace buzzed with a tired kind of chaos. Children chased dogs. Bakers sold bread still steaming from the coals. A girl dropped a basket of olives. He knelt to help her pick them up. She looked up at him and burst into tears. He handed her a coin the size of her face and said, "Olives are important." At the fountain he washed his hands with rose water, then dipped his toe in because it amused him. A boy nearby whispered, "That's him," and another nodded like one does in temples. He walked past a sculptor selling busts. He did not stop. The sculptor began carving anyway. By the time he returned home, the sun was folding gently over the rooftops, and the shadows were long and forgiving. His guests from the tasting were singing something that might have been a hymn or a drinking song, possibly both. He did not join them. He had a dinner to prepare for, or rather, a dinner that had been preparing for him all day, and this time he would wear sandals, maybe. The afternoon had gone well, and evening, as always, would outdo it. Evening did not arrive in Rome. It unfolded, slowly, deliberately, as though afraid to enter before being announced. He liked it that way. The lowering sun poured gold across the marble courtyard, and the shadows stretched long like the sleeves of his silk tunic. He was standing at the centre of his peristyle garden, surrounded by lilies that only bloomed after noon. He claimed they obeyed him. A servant placed a fresh garland of myrtle around his neck. It wasn't necessary. That made it perfect. Dinner would begin soon, but there was time for ceremony. He called it sun dismissal. It involved lighting a single candle and placing it on the edge of his fountain, where it bobbed in a bronze bowl and slowly circled until it extinguished itself. No one understood the meaning. That's why they thought it meant something. His guests were already beginning to arrive. They did not knock. They simply entered, as one does with temples and rumours. The first was a man known only as Apollonius the Younger, though no one had ever met an Apollonius the Elder. He wore purple shoes and kissed his own hand when greeting others. The second was a widow who owned 3 vineyards and 4 husbands, all deceased. The third was a sculptor who had never sculpted anything smaller than a horse. They all complimented the lighting. He nodded as if he had placed the sun there himself. Dinner began with rose water for the hands and poetry for the ears. A young girl, trained by philosophers but paid by his steward, recited an ode to the gods of appetite. It was met with a reverent silence, then applause, then a debate about whether olives counted as fruit. The first course was parrot tongue soaked in pomegranate glaze. No one liked it, everyone praised it. The second course was an entire fish sculpted out of figs, almonds and saffron paste. A joke, perhaps, but also a masterpiece. He had not commissioned it. It had simply appeared, like all great things in his life. Between courses there were performances, a fire juggler who used no fire, a dancer who only moved when no one watched, and a man who swore he could sing backwards. He couldn't, but he tried, and that was enough to earn a ring. Then came a philosopher who tried to debate a parrot. The parrot won. A flute duet played by twins who claimed they had never rehearsed. A mute oracle who blinked once for yes, twice for no. She blinked 5 times and left. He did not eat much. Eating was for guests. He preferred to taste. A grape here, a slice of honeyed lotus root there. He had learned long ago that appetite made better art than indulgence. As night deepened, the conversation turned, as it always did, to death. But not in a sombre way. More like a hobby. Apollonius claimed he had died once in a dream. The widow said her last husband dreamed of his own funeral, then choked on a fig. The sculptor declared that he hoped to be buried standing up, so the worms would have to climb. A senator suggested being cremated inside a hollow statue of Mars. Someone else proposed faking death just to hear their eulogy. He listened, half laughing, half sipping. He didn't speak of death. He didn't need to. People always imagined he would live forever, and he never corrected them. The final course arrived. Ice from the mountains, flavoured with rose and fennel. Impossible, expensive, and ultimately forgettable. Just how he liked his endings. After the meal, they moved to the rooftop for stargazing. Not the kind with charts and names. The kind where people lie back on embroidered cushions, point at lights, and pretend to understand fate. Someone played a flute. Someone else dropped a cup and apologised to Mars. No one was offended. The mood was thick with wine and stories. He lay there with them, half listening, full smiling. They pointed at stars and made up their own constellations. One star became a lover's nose, another a lost sandal. The Big Dipper was briefly renamed the Bowl of Forgotten Lovers. He said nothing. He just watched the sky as if it owed him a favour. A guest asked him what he saw in the stars. He said, "The parts of myself I gave away." Another asked if he ever feared the future. "Only when it's boring," he replied. A quiet settled over them again. Someone whispered about a prophecy, a dream of Rome sinking beneath the weight of its own statues. He said, "Then we shall float on marble." Laughter returned. Then wine. Then silence again. That rare, heavy kind that descends only after too much pleasure. He stood and addressed them, not as a host, but as if he were translating the stars. "Tomorrow," he said, "I shall begin writing my memoirs. They will be brief." Laughter again. Someone toasted him. He toasted the moon. One by one the guests departed. Some on foot, some carried. One disappeared, perhaps by design. He descended the stairs slowly, not from fatigue, from ritual. In his chamber the lights were low and the linens cool. A servant was asleep at the foot of the bed. Another waited with a bowl of perfumed water. He dismissed them with a wave, stood before the mirror, removed the garland, loosened the tunic. He looked at himself, not out of vanity, out of curiosity. Who had he been today? A god? A ghost? A man with too many figs? He smiled. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the ceiling as if expecting it to offer a final opinion. Then he lay back and closed his eyes. Sleep took him softly, like a silk robe dropped from the shoulders. Tomorrow would come, as it always did. But tonight he belonged to no one, not even himself. The morning came in silence, not because the city was still asleep, but because it knew better than to wake him early. The sunlight entered his villa as it always did, first timidly through the high atrium windows, then boldly across the marble floors. It found him already sitting upright, wrapped in a crimson robe, sipping wine from a cup shaped like a seashell. He had not slept long. He never did. Not out of insomnia, but out of efficiency. Dreams, after all, could only compete so much with reality. Today it would be different. Not in action, but in awareness. He had no plans to change his habits, only his posture. He would carry the day with more intention. At least that's what he told himself, as he threw a date into his mouth and nodded to no one in particular. In the courtyard, birds had gathered around the fountain. Not pigeons or crows. Too common. These were doves. Not trained, not tethered. They simply preferred his company. One landed on his shoulder. He whispered something to it. It did not answer. Still, he smiled. The household was quieter today. He had instructed his servants to walk without shoes, not because the noise disturbed him, but because silence was a kind of flattery. The cook prepared him a breakfast he did not touch. The steward handed him letters he did not open. One was sealed with a mark he recognised. He placed it beneath a candlestick and said he would read it if the flame flickered twice. It did not. He dressed without help, a rare thing. He chose a tunic the colour of smoke and a ring he had never worn. A sapphire set in gold given to him by someone he had once forgotten. He thought it fitting. The forum was busy with noise and petty complaints. He wandered through it like a shadow wearing sandals. A senator tried to greet him, but his words fell flat. He nodded politely and moved on. He had no interest in debate today. He preferred the company of fountains and mosaics. At the temple of Jupiter he paused, not to pray, but to admire his own reflection in the polished bronze doors. He looked tired, but in a poetic way, as if he had lived too well for his years. A priest offered him incense. He declined. The gods, he believed, preferred surprise over ceremony. By midday he found himself at a marble bench overlooking the Tiber. It was a spot few visited. Too quiet, too exposed to the wind. He liked it for those reasons. A child selling bread wandered near. He bought 3 loaves, not because he was hungry, but because he enjoyed the astonishment on the boy's face when he paid with a coin the size of his palm. He gave the bread to a dog. The dog followed him for an hour, then wandered off. That felt right. He stopped by a bathhouse. Not his usual, not even private, just ordinary. He sat beside strangers. No one recognised him, or if they did, they said nothing. He listened to the splashing of water, the scrape of pumice stones, the muttering of old men about young things. He liked the ordinariness of it. It made his myth feel more real. When he returned home, the sky was already folding into gold again. He ordered music, then cancelled it. He asked for poetry, then waved it away. He wanted neither distraction nor drama. Just a chair, a shadow, and the soft creak of old marble under his feet. That evening, he did something he had not done in years. He wrote a letter. Not to anyone, not for anyone, just a letter. He began it with, "To the next man who wears this ring," and ended it with, "Remember to laugh at the right moments." He sealed it with wax and placed it inside a vase. Then he ordered the vase to be set upon his highest shelf and never opened unless Rome burned again. A dramatic request, but he liked those. That night, no guests arrived. None were invited. He dined alone, tearing his bread by hand, sipping his wine without commentary. He spoke only once to himself, and only to say, "So this is what peace sounds like." He stood in his garden beneath the stars, wearing nothing but memory. He watched the constellations rearrange themselves in his mind. They no longer needed names. He knew what they meant. He thought of the girl who once gifted him a clay statue shaped like Jupiter with one arm missing. He had kept it. It was still in a drawer somewhere, next to a cracked bronze comb and a coin with a lion's face. He remembered a friend who once swore he'd live forever, and how they'd laughed when the friend fell off a chariot 2 weeks later. He remembered his mother's lullaby, though not the words. Only the melody. It came to him now, like a thread pulled from the night. He hummed it quietly, and then, sometime past midnight, he walked slowly to his bed. He paused at the edge, looked back at the door and nodded, as if someone invisible had just left the room. He lay down, closed his eyes, and this time he dreamed. He dreamed of Rome, not the one outside, but the one that lived inside him, a city with no marble, only voices, a street where every passer-by looked like someone he once knew. He dreamed he was young again, running barefoot through an orchard that never ended, and then older, seated at feast where every course was laughter, and then still, silent, in a bath filled with stars. When he opened his eyes in the dream, it was morning again, and the birds had come to sit at his windowsill waiting for him to begin. It was said, though not often and never loudly, that you had once fallen in love with a fern, not in the romantic sense, though one could never be entirely sure, but in the way certain Victorian gentlemen developed intense fixations on Greek statues, postage stamps, or the particular angle of a moth's wing under candlelight. Your name is Algernon Winthrop Hughes, and you live alone in a brick house that leans slightly westward, much like you do. You are, by every available measure, an unimpressive man. Your moustache is the wrong shape for your face. Your boots are never quite polished. Your eyes, when visible, have the strained gleam of a man trying to identify a Latin root in something that does not need naming. But you have two things that make you notable. One is your vast collection of pressed ferns, some of which have been catalogued in journals that no longer exist. The second is the whisper that you once spent 3 weeks in a hollow log waiting to catch sight of a rare frond that only unfurled at dawn. Your house smells of paper, lemon oil and regret. A narrow staircase groans beneath the weight of no visitors. You own 6 pairs of gloves and no proper winter coat. There are ferns on every windowsill, on every table, and in every book that has ever dared to open its pages in your home. You do not call them plants, you call them your quiet companions. Each morning you rise precisely 1 hour before the milk cart passes. You brew weak tea, stare meaningfully at the kettle, and mutter something about spores. Then you dress, slowly with deliberation, into garments that suggest you have not left the century you were born into. Once attired, you inspect your fern wall. This is a patch of wallpaper in the dining room where you have pinned at least 40 specimens in exact symmetrical rows. You often speak to them, though never of anything serious. Ferns, you believe, prefer small talk. By 7:30 you're usually seen in the fields near Nettlebury Lane, crouched low, adjusting your spectacles, brushing dew from undergrowth. You carry with you a leather-bound journal, an inkwell sealed with wax, and a pair of tiny scissors you refer to as your botanical sabres. Children find you amusing. Dogs ignore you. The local postmistress, Mrs. Endicott, once asked if you were employed by the Crown. You replied only no, madam, by wonder. It has not always been like this. Once, many years ago, you were engaged to a woman named Felicity. She had a fondness for embroidery and a vague tolerance for moss. But she did not understand ferns. When she suggested you cut them back to make space for a writing desk, you wept openly. She left the following week, taking with her a silver spoon and all of your optimism. But you bear no bitterness, only an increasing commitment to chlorophyll. On most days, you take your lunch near a low stone bridge and read aloud to the foliage. You choose Byron on rainy days and Tennyson when the clouds resemble brooding eyebrows. Once you tried Dickens, but the ferns drooped noticeably. You never repeated the mistake. Your neighbours, when asked about you, use words like harmless, eccentric, and probably clean. Children sometimes leave fronds at your doorstep and you collect them solemnly, pressing each one between the pages of a small red ledger you keep beside the fire. Evenings are quiet. You play a worn piano with only 3 working keys. You boil potatoes. You catalogue. Occasionally you laugh. Once, while attempting to iron a leaf, you set fire to your cuff and spent the rest of the evening composing a sonnet to resilience. You have no pets, no callers, and no clear income. It is generally accepted that you live off an inheritance small enough to be invisible, but large enough to afford loose-leaf tea and boots that don't quite fit. And so the days pass, gently, repetitively. Morning tea, fern inspection, field work, whispered poetry, cataloguing, sleep. You do not seek adventure, you do not invite change. But one Thursday in late September, change arrives anyway. It comes in the form of a parcel, long, narrow, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. It bears no return address, only your name, and beneath it the word urgent. You stare at it for 3 hours before opening it. Inside is a single item, a pressed fern, delicately preserved, intricately veined, and entirely unfamiliar. Beneath it, on a slip of parchment, is a handwritten note. You must find where this grows. You sit very still for a long time. Then you pour yourself a second cup of tea, stronger this time, and take out your map of Britain. Not to find the fern, but to remember how to begin looking. It has been years since you left your village, decades since you boarded a train. The world, you suspect, has changed. But perhaps, somewhere out there, a wild frond waits, a calling, a quest, or at the very least, a decent excuse to pack your other gloves. The next morning you are seen walking toward the station, a suitcase in one hand and a fern pressed against your breast pocket. You do not tell anyone where you're going. You only say, "There are stories that ferns tell when no one is listening. I intend to listen. They say royalty doesn't do its own dirty work." But in the stillness of medieval nights, when even the rats knew better than to squeak, everyone, peasant and prince, had one decision to make: get up and brave the dark, or reach beneath the bed. This is the quiet, slightly ridiculous, strangely intimate story of the chamber pot, your grandmother's toilet, your great-grandfather's nighttime companion. Before plumbing came with silver knobs and quiet flushes, people slept with their toilets, sometimes decorated, sometimes dented, always within reach. Let us go back now. Let us lie down in other centuries, in other rooms, and listen for the clink of a lid in the dark. In the grand homes of Rome, indoor plumbing existed, sort of. Aqueducts ran, latrines lined the streets, but not every room had convenience, and so people kept metelle, simple pots tucked under benches and beds. Livia was a servant in one such home. She rose before the sun, her fingers cracked from cold water and scrubbing. Each morning she collected the chamber pots from the family's quarters. She walked barefoot across mosaic tiles, lifting ceramic lids with care, pouring them out behind the kitchen where fig trees grew. She didn't mind the task. What stung worse than the smell was the sight of the mistress's pot, gold-trimmed and etched with vines, while her own mother in Trastevere squatted in alleys. Some day, she thought, maybe a home with a private place to go, a space of her own, not just for sleeping, but for needing. In 13th century England, the night was not silent. Coughs echoed through timber walls, cows shifted in the dark, and under each modest bed lay a clay pot waiting. Maud was a weaver's wife in Devon. She slept beside her husband and 2 children, all curled like commas under a patched wool blanket. When the ache came, low in her belly, she didn't wake them. She reached slowly beneath the bed and pulled the pot into her lap. She whispered a prayer against the cold, one hand resting on her swollen stomach. She was with child again. She hadn't told anyone yet. The pot was warm from the hearth's glow. She hated the sound it made, but she had no choice. She cleaned it afterward with an old rag and ashes, then slizzed it back beneath the straw bed. Then she lay back down beside her family, the smell barely noticeable now. her eyes fluttering shut. Even castles were not immune to the body's call. Guardrobes, the primitive toilets built into stone walls, were only useful if you were willing to walk cold corridors by torchlight. Lady Eleanor would not. Her chambermaid Cecily placed her bordaloo beside the bed each night, a small porcelain pot shaped delicately to slip beneath layers of skirts. It looked almost like a gravy boat, and perhaps that's what it became centuries later in antique shops with no idea of its true purpose. Eleanor hated the act. She was a duchess, descended from knights and landowners, but even duchesses had bladders, and even duchesses hated cold floors. She used the pot in silence, pretending she was still asleep, then motioned to Cecily to take it away. She never asked what happened to it afterward. She simply knew it disappeared before morning, like dreams and shame. By the 1600s, chamber pots had evolved. They weren't just functional, they were decorative, respectable. One might receive a chamber pot as a wedding gift, painted, lidded, fitted with a matching stand. In Paris, they were a symbol of civility. In Scotland, they were engraved with family crests. Etienne was a clerk who lived in a garret above a bookshop. He had one good coat, 2 books, and a chamber pot his aunt had given him. He used it sparingly. He emptied it each morning into the gutter that ran beneath the street's edge. He didn't see it as shameful. It was simply how things were. He liked to think that the pot kept him from the indignity of knocking on a neighbour's door in the night. It was privacy in a world where walls were thin and stairs groaned like old men. In 18th century London, chamber pots filled entire neighbourhoods with dread. So many people, so few pipes, and so the pots overflowed. Enter Thomas, a night soil man. He worked while others slept, dragging a wooden cart through cobbled alleys, wearing boots caked with dried human waste. He had a strong back, a poor nose, and a job that no one else wanted. He didn't think about the people in the townhouses, up in their feather beds, dumping their pots into the street. He just collected. He just emptied. And sometimes, when he passed the baker's window, he wondered how long it would take for the city to build pipes, proper toilets, something civilized. He figured he'd be dead before that happened. He wasn't wrong. And so we find ourselves here. Not in one room, but in many. Not with one pot, but hundreds in hundreds of lives. Livia, Maud, Eleanor, Etienne, Thomas. They each slept with their toilet. Not because they wanted to, because it was the only way. It was ceramic, pewter, tin, sometimes warm, sometimes chipped. It sat beside the bed like a silent friend, and every morning it disappeared, emptied, rinsed, forgotten, until night fell again. The story of the chamber pot is not over. Tomorrow in part 2 we'll follow the pot into Victorian homes and watch as plumbing changes everything. We'll meet the women who designed elegant toilet chairs, the men who laid pipe under London, and the awkward transition period where chamber pots hid behind lace curtains. We'll hear the final echoes of lids clinking shut and ask, what did we lose when we flushed it all away? For now, rest. Let the past settle. You're safe, warm, and far from the night soil. It began with lace. By the early 1800s, chamber pots were no longer bare ceramic or dented pewter bowls. They were hidden in fine woodwork, concealed in padded chairs, draped in velvet skirts and fringed cloth. Because now, the goal was to pretend they weren't there at all. And so, the chamber pot entered its most elegant and awkward era, the age of denial. Let us return to the rooms where shame was perfumed and wrapped in mahogany, where the pot was closer than ever, but no one spoke of it. In Victorian England, manners were king. One did not mention the word toilet at the dinner table. One did not speak of sweat, or breath, or digestion. And yet, every bedroom still had its pot. Evelyn was a governess in a fine home near Bath. She was paid little, but allowed her own attic room. Each evening she would lift the lid on the oak washstand, revealing a delicate porcelain pot painted with tiny violets. It had been a gift. Her first night in the house, the mistress had said, "I trust you'll manage your needs discreetly." She did. She emptied it herself every morning, down a side drain no one saw. and she washed her hands in cold water, always cold before dressing the children. The violet stared back up at her each night like a floral secret. She never mentioned them, not once. By now, chamber pots had become furniture. The close stool resembled a fine padded chair, but when opened revealed a ceramic bowl nestled inside. They were made for modesty, they were made for guests, and in more elite homes the pot lived inside cabinetry, in the corner of a dressing room behind a curtain of embroidered linen. Harold was a butler in one such house. He did not sleep near the pot, he served those who did. He had a key to the guest chambers and a schedule. Each morning before breakfast he checked the pot in each room. Some were clean, others less so. He carried them one by one to the servants' scullery. He rinsed, he scrubbed, and he dried them with a cloth embroidered with the family crest. He never complained. He liked things tidy, and the chamber pots were, in a way, his quiet kingdom. As cities exploded with factories and tenements, chamber pots were everywhere. In working-class London, the poorest homes had no drains at all, just buckets, pails, and sometimes the pot was the only thing you could call a toilet. Sally lived with 6 others in a single room. They shared a bed, they shared bread, and they shared one pot. It was kept in the hearth corner behind a thin sheet hung on a rope. At night, Sally would hold it in until her stomach cramped. She didn't like the others hearing her. One evening she slipped out at dawn and dumped the contents into the alley. She turned her head as she poured. It splashed against the cobblestones, running down into the gutter beside a cat and a crumpled newspaper. She wiped the pot clean and carried it back in like a secret. The 19th century brought pipes, slowly, quietly. In large cities, water closets began appearing in wealthier homes, first in the garden sheds, then in hallways, eventually in their own rooms. But many people did not trust them. They were loud, they used too much water, and worst of all, they were connected to the public sewer. People whispered, "What if the smell comes back up? What if it explodes?" So chamber pots remained, even when the flush toilet was installed, even when tiles were laid and cisterns mounted high on chains. Margaret, a widow in Sussex, had a water closet at the end of the hall, but at night she still used her mother's porcelain pot, blue roses painted around the rim. She didn't trust the toilet. She didn't like the echo of the flush. She didn't want to leave her warm bed to walk a cold hallway at 2 a.m, so the pot remained under the table by her dresser. She used it until her death in 1912. By the 20th century, the chamber pot was fading. Plumbing had arrived. Even modest homes now had water closets. The chamber pot became a joke, a relic, something children pointed at in museums, but not everywhere. In rural towns, in old cottages, in wartime bunkers and farmhouses and sickbeds, the pot endured. James, born in 1933, remembered his grandmother's chamber pot. It sat beneath a thick woolen curtain in the guest room. He wasn't supposed to use it. But one winter, during a storm, the pipes froze. His mother handed him the pot and said, "Only this once." He remembered the clink of the lid, the smell of enamel and dust, the strange comfort of having something near when the world outside was shut off. Today, we no longer sleep with our toilets. They live in tiled rooms with fans and mirrors. They flush politely, they do not speak. But the chamber pot, ugly, necessary, loyal, was once part of every night, tucked beneath royal beds, held by trembling hands in alleyways, scrubbed by maids, painted with violets. They were never glamorous, but they were there, and in a way they still are. In the quiet ritual of getting up in the dark, in the hush of night when the house creaks and we wonder whether to stay in bed or go, in the feeling of needing something close, something private, something small and dependable. The pot has done its work. It carried generations through the night, and now it rests in cupboards, in antique shops, in forgotten corners of family homes. You're not sleeping with your toilet, but for centuries someone did, and they slept soundly, pot nearby, shame tucked beneath the blankets, dreams rising like steam into the rafters. Sleep now. Let the past empty itself. and rest in the knowledge that even history had to go sometimes. We think of toilets as machines now, cold porcelain, chrome handles, a brief hiss and gone, but the chamber pot was never a machine. It was personal, held, emptied, washed by hand. It knew the sound of your sleep, the weight of your silence. It was never far, and in many lives, it was the only witness to what no one else saw. Let us return once more, not to castles or cottages this time, but to the quiet spaces in between. Sick rooms, ships, prisons, hidden corners of the world where a pot did what no one else would. Stay close when the body failed. Henrietta was 40 when illness found her. She could no longer walk. The doctor came and went with little hope, but the pot remained. It sat by her bed like a nurse that never judged. Her sister changed it each morning, wiping the rim with a cloth and lavender water. Sometimes Henrietta apologised. Sometimes she cried, but mostly she just reached for it, eyes shut, knowing it was there. It was heavy, sturdy, made of enamel with a hairline crack along the side. That crack had been there since the war. It never widened, it just held. In some households the pot was kept not under the bed, but in a cabinet near the fireplace. In others it was covered in cloth or given its own stand, like a crown for the unwanted. But in the sick room there was no pretense, just gratitude, quiet, often unspoken. On long sea voyages, chamber pots were carved from wood. Sailors called them slop buckets, or simply the pot. They were shared, often unwashed for days, but even there they served a purpose beyond convenience, a sense of routine, a reminder of land, of comfort, however crude. Thomas, a sailor on the Atlantic route in 1844, wrote in his journal, "We eat, we sleep, we use the pot, and we thank God for all three." The pot was not merely for relief. It was for time. It saved steps. It spared stairs. It offered a few more minutes of rest for the weary mother, the aching farmer, the elderly woman whose joints locked in the cold. Clara, aged 82, lived alone on the edge of the forest in Bavaria. She kept her chamber pot on a table by the window. It was covered with a lace cloth and always clean. Each morning, she would take it outside and pour it beneath her apple tree, then rinse it in the well, and whisper a prayer of thanks. She did not see it as dirty. She saw it as practical, an extension of her body's truth. In some cultures, chamber pots were decorated with humour. In France, some were painted with portraits of disliked politicians. In Scotland, they bore the phrases, "use me well," or "think what you're doing." They were practical, yes, but they were also art, commentary, protest, a place where satire met sanitation. In other regions, they were spiritual. In parts of rural China, the child pot was used during birth and after death. It was placed beneath the bed of a dying elder, not for function, but for tradition, to catch the last of life's weight, to ease the soul's passing. The pot was emptied with care, with respect, with silence. No one spoke of it, but they all understood. There is a strange intimacy to an object that touches your life every single day. Your first act in the morning, your last before bed. It knows when you are ill, when you are pregnant, when you are old. It knows before anyone else. No wonder chamber pots show up in wills, bequeathed to daughters, passed to nieces, painted, protected, because they had seen things others had not, and survived. By the mid-20th century, the chamber pot had become a novelty, a relic on a shelf, something to laugh about. My grandmother used one, people say, like it was a mark of hardship. But for generations it was just life, cleaned by hands that never saw gloves, emptied by men who walked through frost and fog before the city awoke, and not just in homes. In the trenches of the First World War, soldiers sometimes kept small tin chamber pots beneath their bunks, less for comfort, more for necessity. The noise of shells, the danger of stepping outside, the bitter cold. They used what they had, a mess tin, a bucket, a helmet sometimes. No shame, only survival. James, a soldier from Derbyshire, wrote in 1916, "The pot doesn't care if you're scared. It's just glad to be needed. Even in space, the legacy lived on. Modern astronauts use suction-based toilets and sealed waste systems, but every one of them in training handled a basic container, something close to the chamber pot, something reliable when the body did what the body does. Today we no longer sleep with our toilets. They live in tiled rooms with fans and mirrors. They flush politely. They do not speak. But the chamber pot, ugly, necessary, loyal, was once part of every night, tucked beneath royal beds, held by trembling hands in alleyways, scrubbed by maids, painted with violets. They were never glamorous, but they were there, and in a way they still are. In the quiet ritual of getting up in the dark, in the hush of night when the house creaks and we wonder whether to stay in bed or go. In the feeling of needing something close, something private, something small and dependable. It is strange in the end what we grow attached to, not because we love them, but because they served us night after night without ever asking to be seen. Now the pots sit in antique shops, labelled incorrectly, called soup bowls, wash basins, creamers. No one knows their names anymore, but they were faithful, they were real, they were always there. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, remember this. For hundreds of years, people slept with their toilet not because they were primitive, but because they were practical. They worked with what they had, and what they had was small, round, and waiting under the bed. Sleep well, far from the frost, far from the worry of stairs and candles and chambermaids. You are in the age of plumbing. But once, the pot held the night, and it never let it spill. They say the emperor had over 9,000 rooms, but even he needed one small seat to relieve himself. In the heart of Beijing, surrounded by high vermilion walls and tiled golden roofs, the Forbidden City rose like a poem in stone. It was a palace of rituals, echoes, and strict hierarchy. And within this grand city, the business of human waste was no less ceremonial than the rituals of tea or the rites of ascension. The Forbidden City, known as Zijincheng, the Purple Forbidden City, was the home of emperors and the stage for their divinely orchestrated lives. Everything in it served a purpose, a message. Even the toilets, or rather the absence of them in the way modern minds understand. There were no underground pipes, no gurgling flushes, only chamber pots, screens, and silence. The emperor did not use what we might call a restroom. His needs were met in a chamber not unlike a small throne room. There, behind an embroidered screen, was a wooden commode, lacquered in red and gold, carved with dragons, fitted with a silk cushion for the seat, and a basin beneath to collect what the Son of Heaven left behind. That basin, ceramic or bronze depending on dynasty, was lined with sandalwood powder, sometimes wrapped in linen and always scented. Eunuchs, those quiet servants of the inner court, were the only ones allowed near during such moments. Trained to be invisible, they stood just outside the screen, their eyes lowered, ears finely tuned to the emperor's needs. One eunuch, always the same, would remove the basin as soon as the emperor finished, without a word. It was then emptied, scrubbed with ashes and water, and relined with fragrant herbs. The task was sacred in its own way, unseen and unspoken, but crucial. It was not merely about removing waste, it was about preserving dignity. In the Forbidden City, silence was a kind of obedience, and invisibility was a form of reverence. No one ever spoke of the emperor's bodily needs. To speak of them would be to admit he was human, but the emperor was human. He dined on duck and lotus root, drank wines sweetened with osmanthus, and eventually, like all mortals, had to sit. In winter, the basin was warmed before use. In summer, bowls of flower petals and camphor were set nearby to absorb the heat and the smell. Sometimes incense burned faintly in the background, not to please the nose, but to quiet the spirit. There were no bathrooms, no public latrines for those in silk robes. Chamber pots were everywhere, disguised in cabinets, hidden behind scroll screens, even carried quietly in sedan chairs. For the empress and the concubines, similar arrangements were made, Though their screens were taller, their silence deeper. And when a consort became pregnant, her chamber pot was cleaned with water brought from the Temple of Purity, to cleanse what might one day be divine blood. Outside the private chambers, the rest of the Forbidden City functioned on a quiet system of labour. The lowest-ranked eunuchs, boys barely into their teens, were tasked with carrying used chamber pots to the cleaning courtyards. There, among stone basins and cold wells, they scrubbed and rinsed. They worked in rhythm, like a ceremony, because mistakes could not be made. A lingering odour near the Emperor's quarters could cost a boy his position, or worse. No plumbing existed, no underground tunnels carried waste away. Instead, it was carried discreetly, manually. And in this great palace built for harmony, the movement of waste was itself a lesson in balance. Too slow and the scent lingered, too fast and it made noise. Visitors often assumed the Forbidden City was all opulence and incense, but behind every embroidered curtain a basin waited. Behind every carved panel a eunuch stood ready. Cleanliness was not just about comfort, it was about cosmic order. The Emperor was heaven's intermediary. His waste could not be seen as filth, but as something transformed by ritual. The higher one's rank, the more ornate the commode. Some were carved from sandalwood, some inlaid with pearl. There were seats shaped like lotus petals, bowls shaped like plum blossoms. Even the lowest servants were taught how to approach the Emperor's waist with reverence. A story was once told, quietly and only among the oldest eunuchs, of an emperor who fell ill and could not leave his bed. His servant was tasked with holding the basin beneath him, for hours, without moving, without speaking. That servant later became the head eunuch, not because he asked, but because he endured. But not all was solemnity. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, when the pots froze and had to be warmed in coals before use, jokes were whispered. "He who sits too long shall rise with frost on his dignity," one boy said once, and was punished with 5 days of extra cleaning. The Forbidden City ran on timing and silence. Even when the Emperor had to relieve himself, it was scheduled, after morning petitions, before the tea ceremony, never during the parade of tribute. He might nod, ever so slightly, and the eunuchs would know. A screen would be drawn, the basin placed, and the world would wait, respectfully. No plumbing, no pipes, but it worked. The chamber pots were changed, the basins were cleaned, the incense kept burning, and the Emperor remained unspoiled. Sometimes late at night, after the lanterns were out and the stars blinked over the tiled roofs, a eunuch would carry one final pot across the inner courtyard. His footsteps would be nearly soundless, his shadow long. The city, massive and silent, seemed to breathe around him. Even in the dark, duty continued. Because in the Forbidden City, even toilets were a matter of state. And somewhere, beyond the silk screens and gold-threaded robes, the Emperor slept. Content, clean, and wrapped in ritual. At the far edge of the Forbidden City, where the courtyards narrowed and the golden tiles gave way to practical stone paths, a quiet battalion began its daily march. They wore no armour, bore no swords. Their weapons were buckets, brushes, sachets of crushed jasmine, and the unspoken oath of discretion. These were the waste handlers, the unsung eunuchs who carried not scrolls or tribute, but the Emperor's chamber pots. It was a peculiar honour, not one that came with silken robes or plum assignments, but an honour nonetheless. Because to be trusted with what the Son of Heaven left behind meant you were close, not to power itself, but to its echoes, and in a city ruled by rituals, even the echoes mattered. Their work began before dawn, long before the clack of officials' boots or the rise of the incense smoke. They moved in pairs, each with a designated route and a memorised schedule. No pot was ever missed, no scent ever lingered. The path from the Emperor's private quarters to the cleansing yard was known as the fragrant corridor, though it rarely smelled sweet. But it was kept spotless, lined with lemon leaves and worn smooth by decades of silent footsteps. Once a chamber pot was retrieved, it was carried in a silk-wrapped wooden box cushioned and sealed, not for its protection, but for the dignity of those it had served. A eunuch never opened it in public, Even the act of cleaning was performed in privacy, behind reed screens and beside cold water basins that never ran dry. They scrubbed with ash, rinsed with herbal water, and dried with cloths perfumed with rose and ginger. It was not a task for the weak of stomach or spirit. One had to kneel on stone, work in silence, and endure the cold. And always, always, to maintain the illusion that the palace ran on ceremony alone. If done correctly, no one noticed their work. That was the mark of success. Invisibility. The cleaning yard itself was a strange sort of sanctuary, tiled in mossy grey, bordered by scrub trees and perpetually damp. It was here that pots were stacked in orderly rows, dried in sunbeams, and matched to their rightful owners by carved marks along the rims. One belonged to a favoured concubine, one to the emperor's poetry tutor. Another, ornate and pink-glazed, had once belonged to the empress dowager herself. These were not toilets. These were instruments of court etiquette, tools of composure. Some were shaped like lotus blossoms, others like miniature boats, all designed to distract from their purpose. A eunuch once joked under his breath that the pots were so beautiful they made you forget what you had done in them. He was not punished, but he was reassigned to the goose coop. Beyond the logistics, there was the battle against odour. In a city of still air and closed corridors, scent was a threat. Each room had bowls of dried petals. Courtyards had incense braziers. Beneath every commode, before every ceremony, sachets were placed, woven bundles of clove, sandalwood, patchouli and dried citrus. These were not mere perfumes. They were strategic agents of peace. One eunuch, known only as Chung, was famous for his scent blends. He could tame the stench of 5 men with a single ball of resin. His fame spread quietly, and soon even minor nobles requested his presence. He never spoke. His nose did the talking. He once whispered that the emperor's preferred blend had to mimic the smell of spring morning dew, distant, fleeting, and never quite nameable. And it wasn't just about smell. There were rules. When retrieving a pot, one had to bow. Yes, to a bowl. One had to lift it with 2 hands, balanced, never swinging. To allow it to clink or tilt was a disgrace. If ever it spilled, the offender was removed from duty and reassigned to window polishing, which was not nearly as prestigious. Inside the women's quarters, things were even more delicate. The concubines had commodes hidden behind silk curtains, tended by maid-servants trained in silence. When the empress needed to relieve herself, 4 screens were erected, a wind chime was rung to signal all others to look away, and the process was conducted in utter stillness. It was said that one emperor insisted on placing goldfish in bowls near the women's toilets to offer something for the servants to look at while they waited. Cleanliness in the Forbidden City was not merely hygienic, it was political. If a minister was seen wrinkling his nose near the Hall of Supreme Harmony, it could be interpreted as disrespect. If a concubine's chamber was found to emit even the faintest unpleasantness, she might fall from favour. Scents carried stories, and stories carried consequences. Every few weeks, a ceremonial purification day was held. It was not publicly announced, but those in the inner court knew. All chamber pots were replaced, all commodes were relacquered, the incense was changed, the walls washed with lye and lotus water. The emperor would fast that day, not for purity of stomach, but to show that even his body could pause in reverence. In the servants' barracks, jokes were told in whispers. Heaven has 9 dragons, but we clean the 10th. Laughter was rare, but sometimes it echoed through the stone halls like something secret and good. Cheng, the scent master, once left a sachet by a fellow eunuch's bed that smelled unmistakably of dumplings. It was a gift. They didn't speak of it, but everyone smiled when they passed. At night, the waste was buried far beyond the palace grounds. Carted out in sealed boxes by the midnight crew, it was given to farmers or disposed of in the deep ditches behind the outer wall. No one dared speak of what they carried. Even the oxen that pulled the carts had bells tied to their harnesses, not to announce their presence, but to make them seem like just another passing ritual. There was something almost holy in the secrecy, an empire built on rituals so tightly wound that even the echoes of digestion were folded into the choreography. No one broke rank, no one dropped a pot, no one forgot the clove powder, and so the eunuchs walked their paths quiet as shadows. They did not seek praise, their reward was the preservation of peace, the assurance that the emperor would never smell his own humanity, because in the Forbidden City even smells were subjects of the throne. Winter in the Forbidden City was a lesson in endurance. The wind crept through the courtyards like a forgotten ghost. Frost clung to the eaves like pearls, and in the dark hours before dawn, even the most exalted servants wrapped their fingers in silk and moved a little slower. Yet even in this season of stiff joints and stiff rituals, the chamber pots had to be changed, and the toilets, such as they were, still needed tending. The palace had no plumbing, no pipes to freeze or burst, but the basins themselves were another matter. A cold pot in winter was no small discomfort. For the emperor, whose every touch had to be dignified, sitting on a frozen seat was unthinkable. So the eunuchs devised a solution. Each morning before the emperor rose, the selected basin was warmed with coals. A small brazier was placed beneath the commode, not too close, just enough to chase the frost away. In some wings of the palace, more luxurious adaptations appeared. There were padded seats, lined with silk and rabbit fur. In the women's quarters, some commodes were wrapped in velvet and stuffed with goose down. Heat stones, warmed beside the kitchen hearth, were placed beneath the bowls and retrieved discreetly after use. It was a quiet miracle of planning, one of the many ways discomfort was erased before it could be noticed. But winter still left its mark. The water in the cleaning basins froze into thin sheets. The brushes stiffened. The cloths crackled when folded, and the scent of sandalwood became sharper in the cold, biting at the nose instead of soothing it. The eunuchs learned to move faster, to tuck their sleeves tight, and to sing very softly through chattering teeth as they scrubbed in the early dark. They wore extra layers but no gloves. Gloves were too clumsy for delicate work. One had to be precise when handling the emperor's porcelain. Most chamber pots were ceramic, but some were fine porcelain imported from Jingdezhen. They were pale blue with dragons and clouds painted along their rims, and they rang faintly when tapped. One eunuch described the sound as what silence might say if it dared to whisper. The finest porcelain pot was reserved only for the emperor's ceremonial fasts. It was never used for its original purpose, but displayed as a symbol of purity. At least, that was the story. In truth, it was used once a year, on the first morning of the Lunar New Year. The waste collected that day was taken far from the palace and buried in a silk-wrapped box, an offering to ward off illness and misfortune. The act was called returning the body to earth, though it was never written in any record. Inside the palace, special winter sachets were used. Instead of dried petals and clove, they contained pine, mandarin peel, and crushed cinnamon bark. These were said to warm the air and the spirit, and to bring good luck if replaced regularly. The empress once kept a sachet tied to her sash through the entire season, and when spring arrived she gave it to a maid who had lost her mother. The maid never opened it, but kept it beneath her pillow for years. Stories lingered in the palace like steam. One told of a concubine who used to press her hands against the hot stones used to warm the toilet seat, not for comfort, but to remember the warmth of home. Another was of a eunuch who accidentally cracked a porcelain pot during a frost, and wept until the scent master Cheng offered him a dried persimmon and said, "We are all cracked, but we still carry what we must." The Forbidden City held its breath in winter. Everything slowed. The court moved indoors, petitions were shorter, meals were thicker, and still, behind every curtained alcove and painted screen, the silent procession of pots continued. At night, when the oil lamps flickered low and the stars blinked over the snow-draped roofs, the chamber pots were carried out in pairs, one full, one clean. A eunuch named Wu kept a small book, where he marked each transfer with a dot, not a word. He said it was to keep track of the seasons, though no one ever asked how. On the coldest nights, his ink froze before it reached the paper. The outer walls of the palace were higher in winter, not in size but in sound. The snow muffled every echo, every footstep, every whisper. It was said that the snow respected the emperor's dignity and chose to fall softly within his walls, and perhaps that was true, because even the wind quieted near the hall of mental cultivation. There were rules for snow as there were for everything else. No snow was allowed to pile near the commode entrances. It had to be swept before dawn. The water used for cleaning was drawn from a well-kept underground and laced with ginger to prevent freezing. No servant ever spoke of how cold their hands became. To do so would be to break the illusion that the emperor's world was always warm. And always, behind every practical solution, there was symbolism. A pot never cracked in winter was seen as a sign of harmony. If the scent lingered too long, it meant conflict. If a eunuch slipped while carrying a basin, it was said the year ahead would be uncertain. Superstition seeped into the corners of the city like frost into stone. When spring finally arrived, it wasn't marked by flowers or birdsong, but by the first day the basin no longer needed warming. On that day, Wu put a petal inside each pot before carrying it back. No one told him to do it. No one asked him why. But when the emperor sat, he paused. He did not speak. But later that morning he asked for a peach. The palace breathed again, and so did the servants, the eunuchs, the porcelain, and the paths lined with lemon leaves. But they never spoke of winter. Winter was not to be discussed, only endured. And somewhere, in a quiet storage room beneath the kitchens, the cracked pot from years ago remained. Not broken, not repaired, just waiting. Because in the Forbidden City, even porcelain had memory, and memory, like ritual, must be carried with care. Napoleon Bonaparte was not a man known for leisure. He dined in haste, read while walking, and dressed in silence. But there was one ritual he observed with almost religious precision: his morning coffee. It was strong, boiling, bitter, no milk, no sugar, just roasted focus in liquid form. And it came, always, from the same pot. A curved silver vessel with a dent in the side and a handle wrapped in worn leather. It had followed him from the sands of Egypt to the snows of Russia, until one morning in 1814 it vanished. The story of Napoleon's coffee pot is not often told in military histories. It appears nowhere in treaties, nor in memoirs penned by his secretaries. Yet among the valet ranks and quartermasters, the tale of the missing pot is as enduring as Austerlitz. Because on that particular morning, when the pot failed to appear, something in Napoleon shifted. To understand the mystery, one must first understand the man. From an early age, Napoleon used coffee the way others used prayers. He drank it before battle, before speeches, even before bed. He claimed it cleared his thoughts, sharpened his instincts, and gave order to the chaos. His preference was for beans from the Levant, dark roasted in brass pans, then crushed and boiled over flame until the grounds clung to the sides like sediment on a riverbank. He drank it from a shallow silver cup that bore the initials NB, though the lettering had long since worn down. He never drank from porcelain. Too fragile, he said, too aristocratic. The pot itself was a gift, perhaps from Josephine, perhaps not. Its origins were vague. Some claimed it had once belonged to a Turkish pasha. Others said it was made by a blind smith in Marseille, who forged only for emperors. What was known is that it never left his side. During the Egyptian campaign, when tents were overturned by desert winds and ink froze in night air, the pot remained, sometimes tucked in Napoleon's bedroll, sometimes tied to the saddle of his mule. In Spain, it was nearly confiscated by a customs officer who mistook it for a teapot. The man was demoted. At the Tuileries, its place was on a small iron stove just outside Napoleon's study. Each morning a valet named Marchand would heat the water, grind the beans, and pour the brew into the pot with a solemnity normally reserved for mass. The emperor would enter, nod once, take the handle, and sip. He did not speak for the first 2 minutes. Those 2 minutes were sacred. Disruption was grounds for dismissal. Some say it was on those mornings with the pot in hand that he planned his greatest victories. Wagram, Jena, Ulm. As if the steam itself traced the movements of troops, as if caffeine whispered formations into his ear. When aides once asked how he managed to remain so alert with so little sleep, he replied, "I sleep quickly, but I drink slowly." Then came the year 1814. France was weary, the empire fraying, allies closing in. But still, each morning the coffee came, until Fontainebleau. On April 9th, 1814, the emperor rose at his usual hour. He bathed, he dressed, he read dispatches. He walked to the alcove beside his study and waited. But Marchand was already pale. The tray was bare, the pot missing. There had been a fire the night before in the lower kitchens. A minor flare, no casualties. But in the confusion, several items were displaced. Some claimed the pot was moved to avoid soot. Others believed a junior servant had mistaken it for common tableware. Whatever the reason, the pot was gone. Napoleon did not rage. He did not shout. He simply stared at the empty space and said, "Then today, we begin without clarity." For the rest of the day, he was uncharacteristically quiet. Letters were left unanswered. A speech to his generals was postponed. He accepted a replacement pot, tall, brass, decorative, but refused to drink from it. "It smells like indecision," he muttered. The staff searched. The kitchens were turned over, the stables questioned. Even the laundresses were asked if they had seen a silver pot among the linens. No one had, or if they had, they weren't saying. And so, on the eve of his abdication, Napoleon stood at the window, arms crossed, empty cup in hand. Outside, the wind tugged at the trees. Inside, the air was too still. He murmured something no one could hear. Marchand later claimed he said, "Perhaps the pot knew before I did." That night the emperor slept little. He wrote letters. He stared at maps. And in the early hours he requested a cup of boiled water. No coffee, just heat. It was the first time in over 20 years. The loss of the pot might seem trivial, a footnote in a life of empires. But in Napoleon's world, where every detail was deliberate, it was a fracture. His generals noted he was more distracted in those final days, more prone to silence, less inclined to rally. Later, when he was exiled to Elba, someone sent him a new coffee pot, gilded, engraved, imperial. He accepted it with a nod, then placed it on a shelf and never used it. He told a visitor, "Victory is brewed," but only once, and only from the right vessel. Whether the original pot was stolen, lost, or hidden away as a keepsake is unknown. Some say it surfaced in Vienna, passed from one noble collector to another. Others claim it was melted down and reshaped into a candlestick. One theory suggests it was buried beneath a plum tree near Fontainebleau, placed there by a loyal valet who believed no one should drink from it again. But Napoleon never sought it, not publicly. He never demanded its return, as if its absence became part of the ritual. A final silence. In exile, he continued to drink coffee, strong, bitter, nearly burnt, but from plain tin mugs. He spoke less about strategy, more about regret. And once, while holding his cup near the sea, he said, "A man may command armies, but not mornings." The curious case of the lost coffee pot remains just that. Curious. A detail brushed aside by war and conquest. But in the quiet spaces between battles, in the steam rising from a silver rim, something was lost. Not just a vessel, but perhaps the last ritual that made him feel in control. In the imperial apartments of the Tuileries Palace, mornings began not with trumpets but with footsteps. Napoleon Bonaparte, even at the height of his power, rose before dawn. By 5 o'clock, his valet Louis Marchand had already prepared the day's uniform and lit the small iron stove where the emperor's coffee would brew. The drink was no indulgence. It was a mechanism, a gear in the vast clockwork of conquest. Marchand was not the only man to serve Napoleon, but he was perhaps the most consistent. Faithful, sharp-eyed and discreet, he came to know the emperor's habits better than most. He once noted in his memoirs that Napoleon's moods could be charted by the timing and temperature of his coffee. If it was late or lukewarm, the emperor's day would begin with silence. If it was prompt and hot, the day might begin with dictation. The emperor's coffee was prepared with meticulous care, ground from imported beans, boiled in water just off the boil, and poured into the dented silver pot that had become as iconic as his bicorn hat. He drank from a wide-mouthed silver cup, never porcelain. The entire service was unadorned, functional, and deeply personal. Though surrounded by luxury, Napoleon chose simplicity when it came to his coffee. It reflected his Corsican roots, his soldier's pragmatism, and his distaste for aristocratic excess. His preference for coffee was not unique, but his dependency on it was legendary. The Marquis de Caulaincourt, one of his closest advisors, wrote that the emperor could go days without sleep, provided he had strong coffee. His sessions with secretaries and generals could stretch past midnight, often fueled by cup after cup. There were no feasts, no leisure, only maps, memos, and murmured strategy over steaming cups. During the campaign seasons, coffee became even more vital. On the march, Napoleon's portable writing desk included compartments for ink, maps, and a small tin of coffee beans. He brewed it over campfires, often refusing food but never the drink. On the morning of the Battle of Marengo in 1800, he reportedly consumed 2 full pots before issuing orders. When victory was declared, he toasted not with wine, but with coffee. This daily ritual, observed by officers and aides, became a symbol of discipline and focus. It was said that no one approached Napoleon before he'd finished his first cup. One aide-de-camp who interrupted him too early was reassigned to a posting in Dalmatia. The lesson was clear. The emperor's coffee time was sacrosanct. His valet Marchand guarded the ritual fiercely. No one touched the pot but him. He cleaned it with warm vinegar and polished it weekly with a cloth Napoleon himself had used in Egypt. During the winter of 1807, while lodged in Warsaw, the silver handle cracked from overuse. Rather than replace it, Napoleon had it wrapped in leather and tied with brass wire. The repair remained for years, a testament to constancy in a life of upheaval. At court, the emperor's coffee habit was both admired and mimicked. Ministers began holding morning briefings over cups of their own. Even Josephine, no lover of coffee, began serving it during her salons. Diplomats who visited from Vienna or Prussia noted the bitter aroma that clung to Napoleon's chambers, mingling with ink and wax. But the coffee was not merely comfort, it was policy. During the continental blockade, when trade with Britain was forbidden, coffee imports dwindled. Napoleon ordered increased shipments from his colonies, especially from the French-held Caribbean islands. He knew that coffee was not just a luxury, it was morale, both for himself and for his nation. By 1812, as the Russian campaign loomed, the silver pot had been fitted with a special compartment in his baggage train. It travelled with his maps and pistols. As the army advanced into the cold and then retreated in ruin, the pot was kept, guarded like a relic. Marchand recounted how, even amid the chaos of the Berezina crossing, Napoleon insisted on a single hot cup before resuming command. The pot had been dented by then, knocked against an ammunition crate but still serviceable. It was in this devotion that many of his inner circle found something uniquely human. For all the grandeur, the crowns, the decrees, Napoleon remained tethered to a small pot of hot liquid, needing it just as much as any common man did his breakfast. That image, private and steady, became a kind of talisman among the staff. If the pot was boiling, all was well. After returning from Russia, Napoleon resumed his morning ritual at the Château de Fontainebleau. But something had changed. His appetite diminished. His hands sometimes trembled. He began taking his coffee alone, behind closed doors, and the staff was ordered to wait outside. Only Marchand was allowed to remain, and even he noted that the Emperor lingered longer over the steam. By the time of the Allied invasion in 1814, the Emperor's mornings had grown slower. He sipped instead of gulping. He stared at maps without marking them. The silver pot, though ever present, no longer seemed to spark the same momentum. Perhaps it had become a habit instead of a necessity. Or perhaps it had always been both. When the pot went missing, it wasn't just the absence of an object. It was the collapse of routine, the shattering of a thread Napoleon had clung to for decades. For Marchand, it was the first sign that something greater was unravelling. And though the generals prepared strategies and the diplomats whispered of abdication, it was in the alcove by the stove that the true end began. The Emperor once told Caulaincourt, "Discipline begins at the desk, but victory begins at the table, with the right cup in hand." In those final weeks, with that cup empty and the pot gone, even Napoleon seemed to lose the taste for conquest. The morning after the pot went missing, the kitchens of Fontainebleau were turned upside down. Louis Marchand had already questioned every steward, cook and scullion. The ash bins were emptied. The fire grates searched. No one had seen the silver coffee pot, or so they said. Napoleon didn't issue a command to find it. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. His staff, knowing the Emperor's reliance on the ritual, moved quickly, if quietly. A search was begun, not by decree, but by devotion. Marchand sent messages to Paris to the royal silversmiths, asking whether the pot had been returned by mistake or sent for cleaning without authorization. Nothing. The last known sighting was the day before the fire in the lower kitchens. The pot had been placed as usual on the warming tray outside Napoleon's chamber. Then it vanished. What followed was part investigation, part folklore. At first it was assumed that a young footman had misplaced it. Then came the theory that it had been taken by a retreating staff member, a souvenir from the Emperor's private quarters. Rumours bloomed. The pot had been spotted in a market stall in Versailles. A butcher's boy claimed to have seen it in a window in Orléans. None of these reports could be verified. Meanwhile, Napoleon carried on. But those closest to him noticed the difference. General Bertrand, who remained by his side during the decline, noted in his journal that the Emperor had grown more withdrawn. His eyes remain on the horizon, but he no longer sharpens them with steam. Napoleon had long believed in objects, not in superstition, but in momentum. He carried a small talisman from Egypt in his coat pocket for years. His favourite boots were repaired more than 10 times before he replaced them. The silver coffee pot had been part of that philosophy, a thing not sacred but steady. To lose it felt like losing part of his edge. The search continued in odd ways. One of the palace guards sent word to an officer in Lyon to check the officers' mess halls for a silver pot with a dented handle. A stable master posted a notice for a missing object of no monetary value, but immense sentimental importance. Even the Marquis de Caulaincourt made inquiries during diplomatic exchanges, couching it in humour. "Tell your men the Emperor's coffee has grown bitter without his pot." On the streets of Paris the story spread. Satirical pamphlets joked that the Emperor's downfall had begun with caffeine withdrawal. In salons, ladies speculated whether the pot had been stolen by a jilted lover or a jealous valet. Even Talleyrand, that cunning old diplomat, was heard to remark, "Perhaps the pot found someone less demanding to serve." But for those who'd served in the Emperor's court, the loss was not amusing. Marchand continued his search, even as the empire crumbled. When Napoleon prepared to abdicate in April 1814, Marchand asked if he should try one last time to locate the coffee pot. Napoleon looked at him and said, "We are past that now. Let it rest." And yet the search did not truly stop. On Elba, Marchand received a parcel, an anonymous package from Marseille containing a silver lid that resembled the emperor's old pot. He showed it to Napoleon, who examined it carefully, then shook his head. "Number ours was dented like a knee after battle. This is too smooth." After Waterloo, during Napoleon's final exile on St Helena, the British governor Sir Hudson Lowe made sure the emperor had every comfort he could request, within reason. Napoleon accepted a plain brass coffee pot but made no comment about its quality. His new physician, Barry O'Meara, noted in his journals that Napoleon still drank coffee daily, though with less fire than before. The legend of the missing pot began to outgrow its reality. Some said it had been melted down by a retreating soldier who needed the silver. Others believed it was hidden in a wall at Fontainebleau. One tale insisted it was kept by a servant who later used it to water his geraniums, an act of treason turned tenderness. In the years following Napoleon's death, collectors of imperial memorabilia scoured auction houses across Europe looking for anything tied to the great man: swords, letters, portraits. But once, in 1831, an item appeared in a shop in Brussels, a dented silver coffee pot with leather around the handle, unmarked but of high craftsmanship. It sold quickly to a private buyer who claimed it had a military air about it. There was no way to verify its provenance, but stories circulated that the pot had been brought to Belgium by a former imperial guard who swore it had been rescued from Fontainebleau the day after the abdication. Whether this was true or not, the pot was never seen again. The man who purchased it reportedly kept it on a shelf above his desk, never used. He would sometimes touch the leather-wrapped handle and smile. His grandson, when asked about it decades later, said, "He used to call it the Emperor's thunder, said it once woke the whole world." Napoleon never spoke of the pot again after St Helena, but in his final days, when the coffee was brought to him in a plain cup, he sometimes held it a moment longer before sipping, as if expecting a different taste, a different morning, a lost empire, a lost pot, a thread broken. But the aroma lingered. By the time Napoleon stepped onto the rocky coast of St Helena in October 1815, the silver coffee pot was long gone. The empire had fallen. The grand armies disbanded. He was no longer emperor, just General Bonaparte, prisoner of Britain. But each morning, even in exile, he rose and asked for coffee. The house at Longwood was damp and windswept, built for discomfort rather than dignity. Its windows rattled in the wind, the ceilings dripped in the rainy season. Yet Napoleon adapted. A tin kettle replaced his beloved pot. The British supplied beans, coarse, bitter, and often stale. Still, he drank it, slowly, silently, holding the tin cup a little longer than necessary. Sir Hudson Lowe, the governor assigned to oversee Napoleon's exile, monitored every request. Extra blankets, ink, even lemons had to be approved. But the coffee was always permitted. Perhaps even Lowe understood. It wasn't a luxury. It was a thread to who he had been. Barry O'Meara, Napoleon's Irish physician on St Helena, recorded how the emperor clung to his morning routine. He would sit by the small window in his study, looking east, cup in hand. There were no maps to mark, no orders to give. But still he drank as if the world might ask something of him. One morning, O'Meara found him dozing upright in the chair, an empty cup balanced on his knee. When he stirred, he asked, "Doctor, do you think they kept my pot?" O'Meara replied gently, "I'm sure someone did." Napoleon nodded once and said, "Then it lives." In those long days of monotony, coffee became less of a stimulant and more of a comfort. He took it after his walks along the cliffs, after dictated pages of memoirs, sometimes even before bed. The ritual no longer prepared him for battle, it prepared him for memory. When he dictated his reflections to General Bertrand, he rarely mentioned the pot, but he did say this: man can survive loss, of land, of title, of freedom. But he must be allowed to keep something that makes him feel alive before the world awakens. In letters home, Marchand wrote that Napoleon had become quiet in the mornings, more than ever before. He sips with reverence, he wrote, as if expecting the past to rise from the steam. On the rare days when French ships passed close enough to be seen, Napoleon would stand with his coffee on the terrace and watch the horizon. He never waved, he never called out. But Marchand suspected that in those moments the Emperor imagined being remembered, not for the wars but for the quiet things. In early 1821, Napoleon's health declined rapidly. He still rose for coffee, but it was no longer the same. His stomach rejected it. The bitterness lingered. He switched to barley water, then warm milk. The tin kettle remained unused by the stove. One of the last mornings he drank coffee, he looked down into the cup and said, "This is the taste of the world when you have no reason left to stir it." When he died on May 5th, 1821, at the age of 51, his personal items were catalogued for return or disposal. Among the books, coats and hats was the kettle. The British didn't think much of it. It was shipped back to France unmarked. Some say it rests in a museum archive, mistaken for a soldier's mess pot. Others claim it was given to a former servant who kept it hidden out of respect. But the original silver pot, the dented leather-handled relic from the Empire, was never found. In the decades after his death, historians focused on battles, treaties and betrayals. But among the memoirs of those who knew him best, Bertrand, Marchand, Caulaincourt, there are whispers of the coffee ritual, of the quiet hour before the commands, of the steam rising not just from a cup, but from a man trying to steady the world. 1 century later, a young French officer stationed in Algeria wrote home about a strange tin kettle displayed on a mantel in an old farmhouse. The family claimed it had belonged to a great man once loved by a continent. He said he touched it, and for a moment he smelled something familiar: burnt beans and ink, steam and leather. "No man can take his empire to the grave," Napoleon once said, "but he may carry the habits that made it." Perhaps that is all the pot ever was, not a relic, but a habit made sacred by repetition, a symbol not of power but of constancy, of one man's determination to begin each day with heat and clarity, even as the world fell apart. In the end, the story of the lost coffee pot is not about where it went. It's about what stayed with him after everything else was gone. She was called Mary, but the court remembered her by another name, the English Venus. Mary Boleyn, sister to the more famous Anne, was a woman whose reputation was whispered in hallways, scribbled in ambassadorial dispatches, and passed from lip to lip in the candlelit corners of Tudor court. Before Anne turned the kingdom upside down, it was Mary who had caught the king's eye, or rather, 2 kings. She was said to have been the mistress of King Francis I of France, who described her as his English mare, and bragged crudely of her presence in his bed. The truth of that remains cloudy, but what is certain is that Mary was sent to the French court young, beautiful, and politically useful. She returned to England with her name wrapped in rumour. Mary was born around 1499, the eldest daughter of Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard, an ambitious, well-placed family with ties to the royal court. While her younger sister Anne would eventually rewrite the monarchy's future, it was Mary who first entered its inner chambers. Like many daughters of nobility, she was raised with the aim of becoming an asset. Fluency in French, a touch of courtly charm, a decent hand at embroidery, these were not hobbies, they were currency. At around 14, Mary was sent to serve in the household of Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, who was briefly Queen of France. When Queen Mary returned to England after her husband's death, Mary Boleyn stayed behind at the French court. There, in that sophisticated and scandal-prone palace, Mary acquired both refinement and reputation. Rumours of her involvement with King Francis spread quickly. Though his lewd boasts are the only evidence the damage was done, Mary Boleyn, whatever her conduct, returned to England with her name already sullied. It wasn't long before she caught Henry VIII's eye. Records suggest she became his mistress around 1522, though exact dates are scarce. What is known is that during her time as Henry's favourite, her husband William Carey, a courtier of modest status, received lucrative grants and positions. The implication was clear. Mary's favour came with rewards, though not for herself directly. The affair is notable for its opacity. Unlike later mistresses, Mary did not gain prominence, no titles, no public acknowledgement. She remained on the fringe of power, not centred in it, and yet her presence had weight. She attended court, appeared in masques and pageants, and bore 2 children, Catherine and Henry, whose paternity would be debated for centuries. The question of Henry Carey's parentage lingered. Born in 1526, during or shortly after Mary's relationship with the king, the timing raised eyebrows. Yet Henry VIII never acknowledged him, as he had done with his son by Elizabeth Blount. This silence speaks volumes. Either the child was not his, or the affair with Mary had become inconvenient. When her relationship with the king cooled, Mary's descent was swift. Unlike Anne, she lacked the ambition to convert intimacy into power. She resumed her place as a wife to William Carey, but he died in 1528 of the sweating sickness, leaving her in financial peril. With no favour at court and 2 children to raise, Mary turned to her family for support. It was Anne, still rising in Henry's affections, who arranged a modest pension for Mary. There was no public gratitude. The Boleyns were strategic, and Mary's presence was a reminder of past scandal. As Anne prepared for queenship, her sister became a shadow. Yet Mary did not retreat completely. She continued to attend court, though less frequently. Her name appeared in letters, often as a footnote, a figure just outside the circle of consequence. Her beauty, once legendary, faded from song and speech. What remained was ambiguity. A woman once central to 2 monarchs' attentions, now peripheral. She was not a villain, nor a heroine. She did not hunger for crowns, but neither did she avoid the heat of power. In many ways, Mary Boleyn was a mirror of her time, valuable when useful, disposable when spent. And yet, even in obscurity, she left marks. Her children, particularly Henry Carey, would rise. Elevated by Elizabeth I, Anne's daughter, Henry would become Baron Hunsdon. The irony is sharp. The illegitimate, unacknowledged child of Mary would be given honours by the niece he never publicly claimed as kin. Mary's early affair with Henry VIII may not have changed the world as Anne's marriage would, but it prefigured the perilous game that followed. The throne was not just a seat, it was a trap, and Mary stepped into its margins first. As part 1 ends, we see her not as history has often shown her, the other Boleyn girl, but as the one who came first. The one who learned that proximity to power may warm, but it burns faster than it blesses. In the spring of 1528, as plague crept through the streets of London and the court fled the city for cleaner airs, Mary Boleyn lost her husband. William Carey succumbed to the sweating sickness with cruel speed, leaving Mary a widow with 2 young children and no fortune to shield her. Grief in Tudor England was a quiet thing, but poverty was loud, and Mary was now both grieving and poor. Her sister, Anne Boleyn, was rising like a comet. Where Mary had once warmed herself near the sun, Anne had become it. By the time William Carey's body was laid to rest, Anne was in the king's favour, unyielding, magnetic, and, unlike her sister, shrewd. The irony was bitter. Mary had once opened the door to Henry's affections. Now Anne was about to walk through it, crowned in silk and cunning. Mary appealed to her family for help. It was Anne who responded, arranging for her sister to receive a small pension from the crown. It wasn't much, but it kept Mary afloat. She remained on the periphery of court, careful not to draw attention. Her presence tolerated more than welcomed. To many courtiers, she was a relic of the king's past indiscretions, a footnote the Boleyns would rather forget. Yet even in her diminished state, Mary managed to commit the one act that would sever her ties to the crown for good. She married again. Not to a nobleman, not to a diplomat, but to a common soldier, William Stafford. He was brave, decent, and entirely inappropriate. Their union, done in secret, was born of love, not strategy, and in the Tudor court, that was nearly treason. When the marriage was discovered in 1534, the fallout was immediate. Anne, now Queen of England, was furious. She called her sister's actions shameful, reckless, ungrateful. Mary was banished. No ceremony, no scandal, just silence. She was dismissed from court and cast out of favour with the family who had once ridden her coattails into royal presence. Mary wrote to Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, in desperation. Her letters were humble, pleading, human. In one, she confessed that she had married for love, not gain, that she was the happiest creature in the world to have found a man who cared for her as she was. Her joy was not rewarded. Cromwell offered no help. The court remained indifferent. She and Stafford lived in exile, likely in the countryside, away from the court's venom. They scraped by, largely forgotten. Mary's children, Catherine and Henry, were taken under the care of her in-laws and later the court, especially Henry, whose education and favour suggested someone, perhaps quietly, had an interest in his future. Mary, meanwhile, disappeared from public life. For nearly a decade she left no trace in letters, records, or court chatter. She had no servants, no titles, no pages to write her name into ledgers. But in those quiet years she had what she had always lacked: choice. A husband she had picked herself, a life of her own making. Her exile did not erase her, but it made her into something rare, a Tudor woman who stepped away. Unlike Anne, who would die on the scaffold in 1536, or Catherine Howard, who would follow her fate, Mary survived the court by leaving it. It's tempting to see her as the failed sister, the one who didn't rise high enough, but history, written largely by men loyal to kings and queens, often misses the quiet victories. Mary did not win fame, but she won freedom. She did not die for love, she lived for it. By 1540 her name was only mentioned in relation to others: her children, her notorious sister, her brother George. George, executed alongside Anne, was once thought to have mocked Mary's second marriage. It is said he called her foolish. He died branded as incestuous, a pawn in Anne's fall. Mary lived. She died in 1543, likely around the age of 44. The cause of her death remains unknown, unrecorded. There was no grand burial, no tomb carved with praises, no monuments raised in her name, only the small notes in parish ledgers and the legacy of her children. One of those children, Henry Carey, would be elevated by Queen Elizabeth I. He became Baron Hunsdon, served as a Member of Parliament, and was offered the title of Earl of Monmouth, a title he declined. He bore the mark of favour, but also the stain of ambiguity. Elizabeth never publicly acknowledged him as kin, though she granted him lands and roles befitting a relative. The court never stopped whispering. What remains of Mary Boleyn today is not scandal but suggestion, a face in the background of portraits, a footnote in the letters of others, a woman remembered not for what she seized, but what she refused. As her sister climbed toward a crown, Mary stepped away. In a court where women were valued for their use, she dared to live uselessly. In the margins of Tudor history, Mary Boleyn is easy to overlook, but it is in the margins that some of the truest lines are written. When Mary Boleyn died in 1543, the world did not stop. There were no bonfires in the hills, no bells rang in mourning, no chroniclers dipped their quills in ink to recount her passing. Her death, like much of her later life, was quiet, one final step into the background of a history that rarely made room for women like her. But Mary was not erased, not really. Her name appeared in the records, if only briefly, a burial entry, a land document, the odd mention in the will of an acquaintance, and her children, especially Henry Carey, would ensure that some part of her endured. In a court obsessed with legacies, Mary left a quiet one, not built on scandal, but on survival. The irony was that while Anne Boleyn's name became legend, controversial, divisive, endlessly dissected, Mary's slipped into something softer, a whisper, not a war cry. Yet the contrast between the sisters became all the more striking in the years following their deaths. Anne was martyred by ambition. Mary had abandoned it altogether. And in that choice lay the beginning of something rare: peace. The world that Mary had once known had shifted by the time of her passing. Henry VIII was on his sixth wife, a pale and dutiful Catherine Parr. The great schism with Rome had been finalised. England had become a Protestant nation, its old monasteries stripped and its saints exiled to memory. Power had changed hands more times than the church altar cloths. Yet amid these transformations, the quiet lineage of Mary Boleyn held. Her daughter Catherine would marry well. Her son Henry would serve Elizabeth I with loyalty and distinction. Some even whispered that the Queen saw herself in him, not merely in temperament, but in blood. Elizabeth never married, she left no heirs, but she surrounded herself with men she trusted, and Henry Carey was among them. Mary's story might have ended with her burial, but it didn't. Not really. For in 1558, when Elizabeth took the throne, the Boleyn name returned, not in infamy, but in favour. The sister who had once been banished for marrying for love now had a son at the Queen's side. If Mary had lived to see it, perhaps she would have smiled, or perhaps she would have said nothing at all. Silence, after all, had served her well. She had learned what her sister had not, that love cannot be leveraged at court, and that peace is rarely found in proximity to a throne. She had learned to retreat before the tide could take her. In doing so, she had carved out a life, a real one, beyond the walls of power. Historians have speculated much about Mary Boleyn's affair with Henry VIII. How long did it last? Were her children truly his? Did she ever regret her choices? The truth is, we don't know. She left no memoirs, no damning letters or romantic declarations. Her life is pieced together from fragments, court records, land grants, whispers. But in some ways, that makes her story all the more compelling. She was not writing for posterity. She was living for herself. And perhaps that's the greatest scandal of all. In a world where women were expected to scheme or suffer, Mary did neither. She loved. She lost. She walked away. And unlike so many others at court, she lived long enough to die an ordinary death. That is not to say her life was small. On the contrary, it was filled with risks others dared not take. To marry a commoner was to forfeit position, security, even family. To leave court was to disappear. But Mary did not flinch. In her letter to Cromwell, she said it plainly. She was happy. And in Tudor England, that might have been the most radical statement of all. There is a tendency in history to measure a woman's worth by the men who loved her, or didn't. But Mary's worth lies elsewhere. Not in the shadow of Henry VIII, not even in relation to Anne. Her story matters because it shows a different kind of courage, the courage to step away, to choose obscurity over spectacle, to live without applause. We often glorify the queens and mistresses who played the game brilliantly, who died dramatically, who left behind scandalous legacies. But Mary left behind something quieter and perhaps more lasting. Her blood ran through the veins of courtiers and poets. Her children bore witness to a New England, and her silence, carefully chosen, speaks volumes still. Mary Boleyn has no grand tomb in Westminster, no marble effigy carved in her likeness, but her memory lingers in the softened lines of portraits once thought to depict Anne, in the delicate lace of family trees, in the wary eyes of those who understood the cost of survival. The Tudor court devoured its own. Ambition was often a death sentence and love a liability. Mary navigated both and lived to see the world turn without her. She did not change history, but she endured it. And in the end, isn't that the truest mark of resilience? Her story closes not with triumph or tragedy, but with something rarer, dignity. And for a Boleyn, that may have been the greatest legacy of all.